Hello and welcome, everybody. So, my name is Steven, and this is the show where we bring together experts to break down some of the most fundamental topics in HR. Today, our topic is internal recruitment, and I have two amazing panelists with us here today. We have Tyler Fisher, who is a senior recruiter at ReliaQuest, and we have Kelly Loudermilk, talent innovator. So we're trying something a little bit different this time. We just have two panelists. It's going to be a little bit more of an intimate conversation. They're each going to have a little bit more time to kind of dive into their personal experiences and go through kind of the knowledge and wisdom that they have to share with each of you. So let's jump right in. So glad that both of you could be here. And internal recruitment. I want to start by just laying out the definition here because personally, as I was looking into this subject, I thought it was a lot more narrow than it ended up being. So, Tyler, I'd love to just throw this one over to you. What is internal recruitment?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to look at it is recruiting within your organization. So filling a role with somebody that you already have instead of going outside.
Yeah, there you go. And Kelly, anything you'd add to that?
I mean, a lot of people assume internal recruitment means the actual recruiter part, right? Like if it's an agency recruiter versus an internal recruiter. So exactly what Tyler said, it means that you're recruiting from the resource internally. That can include promotions, role changes, reorganizations, transfers, etc. So there's a lot of different types. Like you said, people think it's super narrow, but Tyler gave us a really great overarching definition, and that can go into a lot of different areas. But yes, it is truly just what Tyler said, recruiting from your resources internally.
And what do companies really have to gain by that, right? Like, because there's a little bit of mentality here where I'm thinking, I need a new skill set in the organization, and it probably makes sense to find someone new who can bring something new to the culture of the organization and like a new mindset. Maybe they have like a fresher industry view, but why? What is the point? Like, what do organizations have to gain from looking internally first or at the same time? Tyler, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest areas is culture. People feel valued and appreciated when they have increased opportunity within the organization to move and to grow. I mean, the other thing is it costs less money and you can usually fill a role more quickly. So when you look at talent acquisition as a function of the business and you're looking to run lean or you're looking to run smart, you can fill roles faster if you're looking at to do that internally because you probably already have the talent there. They're probably already vetted to some degree. You know who they are. And you usually also have decreased onboarding time since they're already familiar with the organization and at least somewhat of what the function of the role would look like.
Yeah, yeah. Just to double click on that real quick, throw out some timelines here, right? Like if you recruit externally versus internally, are we talking, you're going to save 3 weeks, you're going to save a month, 2 months, a year? Like what has been your experience, Tyler and Kelly as well?
It could be all of those. And so I think it also depends on what the needs of the organization are and the direction the organization is looking to go. So some of the ways I look at it is, do we need more of the same or do we need to go in a different direction? So if we're in a fast growing organization that really just needs to continue on the trajectory that they're on, that's a great time to look internal. Or if you're at a place in an organization where you need to develop a skill set within a role, excuse me, that maybe doesn't currently exist within your current talent pool or with your current organization, that may be a time to look external as well. But really, you could be saving weeks, months, a year, whatever that looks like, if that person is already there, because the interview process, while it may mirror an external candidate, you don't have to find them.
Yeah. I think we'll get more into the process in a second here, but before we do, Kelly, anything you'd add on the benefits that you see of internal recruitment?
I mean, it really comes down to is tenure and turnover. One of the biggest things that people don't realize is that if you don't talk about growth opportunities or even showcase growth opportunities within the first couple of months, if not the first year, the likelihood of that employee staying with your company drastically decreases, almost 50%. And for women, if they don't see something within the 2-year time frame, they are more than 80% likely to start looking for their new role. So growth opportunities are huge. And that's one of the main benefits when it comes to internal recruiting. It really allows you to create growth opportunities, as well as you can create succession planning from that. And that's a little bit more of an advanced topic, but this is the start of that conversation is internal recruiting. So I really believe that the main benefit is not only the growth of your employees, but the growth of the company. And it allows you, especially if you're backfilling that role of that lower level employee, those are going to be a little bit easier to find than maybe more of an advanced skill set, depending on the position, like Tyler said, because there are some positions that can take upwards of a year to fill, depending on how technical it is. And sometimes it makes sense to promote within, and sometimes it makes sense to come from an external standpoint. But really having that conversation, I think, helps tremendously on the turnover, the retention, and the overall just like growth opportunities of your people.
Yeah. Tyler, I see you unmuting there. Did you have something else you want to add on that? Piggyback on that, or?
No, well, I was going to talk. Kelly mentioned career pathing, and that's a big part of this is allowing people to understand where they can go within an organization. And the other piece I was going to add, we may talk about this more later, but I know one of the hurdles to internal recruitment is kind of that conversation of, hey, we would love to be able to move you up in this organization, but you're irreplaceable in the role that you're in right now, right? And I think that is such a horrible reason to not promote somebody or move them into another role that they may be a better fit for just because they are so good in their current role. Take the time to find their replacement and understand what that process may look like. But I don't think that should be the reason why people aren't moved into a role if they're qualified for it.
Yeah. Let's go there right now. Let's go for it. So, because that is the fundamental problem, I think, that you find with internal recruitment, that, hey, I just recruited this person, but now I have to recruit someone else to replace that person, right? And what are like creative ways? I mean, do you see that as a big issue, or Tyler, you're kind of sharing that like that's the best possible thing you could do is need to replace one of your best employees. And,
that is a great place to be. And I think one way to look at it, Kelly mentioned some statistics already. I think the reality is if you don't do that, you're going to backfill them anyways because they will go somewhere else that will provide them with that opportunity. So you're kind of you may be trying to save yourself that headache or that hassle, but you're probably going to be facing it anyways if you don't give that person the opportunity for growth.
Yeah. Any additional thoughts on that one, Kelly? I mean,
I absolutely agree with Tyler. I mean, you're either going to shoot yourself in the foot or you're going to prepare to scale. The number one way to scale, especially if you are in a hyper growth mode, is to promote within. You can upskill them in ways that make sense. They already know how you fundamentally operate. You can always still have them train their replacement or help them understand what the best practices are, especially if they're irreplaceable. But it's better to have them still in the organization, upskilling, leading, or whatever that may look like, and backfill the easier position to fill, because there are more entry-level people that are going to be open to applying to jobs with shorter timelines and turnaround times and onboarding than somebody who's going to be super senior level or technical, especially in this job market. It is one of the hardest ones when it comes to senior level tech. And so if you are going to not invest in that upskilling or that ability to grow them, just like Tyler said, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot anyways. So like, why not do it? Save the risk, because the reward is going to be so much better, and you're going to see more like employee referrals come from that. You're going to see more buy-in from things. You're going to create another level of management or supervisory skill sets, leadership skill sets that are only going to help you scale or grow long-term, depending on what that looks like. But it's always helpful to have some sort of growth in place than to just ignore it and hope that for the best, because it's just going to shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, man, that's fascinating. You both made some great points there. Let's get into like the specifics of how we actually, because I think people, hopefully people are sold on the idea at this point that are listening, right? Like, you guys had some really great things to say about why we should be doing this, but let's get into specifics around how we actually start doing that. And I want to start with kind of like, let's say we post a new job, right? Or let's back up even a little bit and say we identify something we need in the organization, a skill set or like a new position that is opening up. Who sees that first? Is that internally? Do you share it with the internal group first, and then you're like, okay, now let's share it with the external people because we couldn't find anyone internally? Or is it the reverse? External first, post the job, and then if we can't find anyone externally, we share with people internally? Or is it something that goes out at the same time to both of those groups? Kind of a long question there, but Kelly, I want to give you the first word on that one.
I prefer both at the same time, mostly because certain state laws do require for you to give the opportunity for any external posting to your internal candidates as well. So Colorado is one of those. New York is following with the pay transparency law. California tends to be something that favors that, although they are not as specific in regards to those posting requirements as Colorado and New York with the pay transparency laws. But based on that, if you have a job, regardless of whether or not you want to internally recruit, you now have to let all of your people know that that position is now open and available for both external and internal candidates. So for some people, it's required by law, but whether or not that's practice, it's one of those things that people are learning, right? So I like to personally post at the same time and give the opportunity for both. You do sometimes put a priority over the internal candidates versus the external, just because they are internally capable of navigating situations better since they already understand the nuances of the role. But some companies I've seen also do the internal first, and then they open to external. And sometimes they only open to external due to the fact that there are federal requirements that they have to meet for EEOC compliance because they're federal contractors. And so they have to make sure that they get the internal pieces first, then they post external for those requirements. They may or may not even look at external candidates at that point in time, because I don't know if you've seen rants on LinkedIn or Twitter, but some of them are kind of like, I just went through this huge process only to go for an internal candidate. Like, why did I not even know that there was an internal candidate, or why did they even look at me? It's because sometimes they have to, federally speaking. And those are much larger organizations. And you're not going to see newer HR practitioners necessarily in those situations. But I think best practice at the same time, that's my personal opinion. Most larger companies, they may practice it a little bit differently depending on their situations.
Yeah, perfect, Kelly. Tyler, what do you think? Any dissenting opinion here? It's totally okay to disagree. And by the way, I think Kelly also introduced the idea of like, if we're posting this internally, that means we need some sort of internal job board or some probably piece of technology as well. So I'm curious to hear about any tools as well. But go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, and no, I was curious to see what Kelly said first to see if I would disagree, but I completely agree. One, for requirements by law within different regions, but two, I think if I look at it from two different perspectives, the candidate experience perspective and the culture perspective, I think it makes sense to just choose equity as your path. So even if you maybe already have a strong front runner internally, whatever that looks like, I think that giving people broadly the opportunity to apply to a role is usually a best practice. I do understand the frustrations that candidates have, and I see it on LinkedIn all the time. I just went through a lengthy interview process just to be notified they went with an internal candidate, and I get how frustrating that is. At the same time, it's competitive, right? it's likely that you were not the only one who was rejected for that role. It's likely there were a lot of people in consideration and a lot of people in play. And at the end of the day, if there's one role to fill, there's one role to fill. So I think it makes sense to post them both at the same time. Also, because you also see the rants on the other side of the coin, where somebody said, "Hey, I've been here 3 years. I'm totally qualified for the role, and they're posting it externally. What is this garbage?"
Mhm.
So I think that when you just have a company policy, it's usually the safest way to go. We're posting internally. We're posting externally. We want this opportunity to be broadly available. To me, that's usually the best way to go. I think that as far as tools go, yes, you probably do want to have an internal job board. If you don't have that, it's not the end of the world. I think there are other ways that you can post that information, even if it's just sharing the external job post and saying this is the job post that we have based on what we have. Print it out and put it in the break room if you're in office. Whatever type of internal communication method you have, if you're internal, it can still be posted in the information dispersed. Ideally, yeah, you do want to have that internal career site as the best solution, at least I think. And I also understand that when you have internal candidates, you may have people applying for jobs they're not qualified for, and that happens externally too, right? It's a little bit easier to have that conversation with an external candidate because you don't work with them every day. Internally, it's a little more difficult to have that conversation, and so I also usually recommend, if you're creating an internal job post, to add in the specific requirements that your organization has or your policy is internally as well, whatever it looks like. If it is tenure within the organization or however the organization defines that, I think it makes sense to have those internal qualifiers, because we all know applying for a job and getting turned down is not fun. And so you don't want this to be a morale. You don't want this to decrease the company morale, right? You only want to be doing this to increase company and people morale. So I think it's also important to make sure that you do set clear expectations when you post internally of what the qualification parameters are for internal candidates, and make sure that people, HR, recruiting, hiring managers are available to have conversations.
Yeah, I want to talk about that next, right? That idea of like rejecting internal candidates. Like that's kind of rough. It could really damage their employee experience. But just before we go there, Kelly, I want to just hear your thoughts as well on the job posting. When you're doing when you're doing external recruiting, is just posting the job usually won't be enough, or might not always be enough, right? Like you have to be very proactive. Maybe you're reaching out to specific candidates or boosting job posts and things like that. But how would you mirror that internally? Are you reaching out to specific departments or candidates that you think would be great for the job and say, hey, I really think you should apply to this? Or do you just put the post out there and kind of let, whoever apply to it and just assume that they've seen it?
So I'm going to give you not a great fun answer because it's not specific, right? It really depends. And it really is kind of all of the above. I've done all of the above in some of my clients in their different situations. Personally, I don't think it matters if you have an internal job board versus an external. I primarily work with smaller businesses where they can't have the separation. Those types of separations tend to be in much larger organizations that have much more complex tool requirements or needs. ISMs, Workday, a lot of those bigger company names or technologies have the capacity to do an internal versus external. And they're so large anyways, usually with the companies, that it makes sense for that purpose. When it comes to smaller companies, you don't have the budget for like a Workday. I like Workable. I like Bamboo HR. Eddie has, different types of requirements as well. All of these different technologies can still exist for an internal board. You create the job posting like you do. I do agree with Tyler that I do think having more information from an internal standpoint is key to help facilitate much clearer expectations. You can send out another email regarding that or let people know that or have conversations regarding that. But for a lot of my clients, They have the one job posting for both external and internal. And the difference is that when you apply, it just puts a tag on it that says internal or referral. And a lot of those types of technologies have that built-in capacity. So that helps to keep things organized, but it's still all one job posting. That's what I've seen most success on for much smaller organizations, because they don't have the ability to do that. When it comes to letting people know, I think you can identify key people that are ready for a promotion or who may be a key high potential leadership candidate long term, but may not be absolutely ready. But this is a step in that direction, and we want them to be considered for it. So you can absolutely identify key individuals and help them in that process as a next step. Or you can, just post it. But I think it really depends on the organization. It really depends on the identified individuals, if there are any, and just communication. So having those posts internally, Slack channels, team channels, whatever you can, emails. I know Workable sends out an email to anytime a job's posted to everyone who signed up on their platform to say like, hey, this has been posted, you can refer, you can apply, and they have a whole thing regarding that. So it just depends on how the normal communication channels go in terms of promoting that. But I have had people both identify individuals internally as well as high potentials internally to get them actively involved in that, knowing necessarily that it may not even lead to a hire, but it's something that we wanted them to go through in order to facilitate growth opportunity and let them know we are considering them for future growth opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great point. I thought that was really thorough. Appreciate that, Kelly. Tyler, I want to bring us back to the conversation that you were kind of taking us into around internal rejection. I'm going to put out an absurd example here and then get both of your reactions. But let's say a company is hiring a CEO, right? And everyone in the company applies to be the CEO internally. And you look at all the resumes, no one is qualified to be the CEO. You go with an external CEO. Suddenly the CEO comes in, maybe there's some animosity now because the COO thought that he was a shoo-in, and so-and-so thought some random entry-level person, had delusions of grandeur and thought they would be the CEO. Who knows, right? But man, how do you handle turning people down, and then they're going to work with the person probably that beat them out for the job? Tyler, I'll give you that first, and then Kelly, I'll hear your reactions as well.
So, okay, maybe that is a little bit of an absurd example, but the way that plays out is far too common that you do have people applying for a job internally, and then you hire somebody externally, and the next thing that these internal applicants know is that there's now somebody in that job that just started and they didn't get any feedback. If everybody in the whole entire company applied, this may be difficult, but the process I always suggest has to be getting that feedback before you just have somebody randomly starting on a day for a job that they applied for and thought they were still in consideration for. And you see that it's very common because these are difficult conversations to have. And sometimes they happen after the fact or ad hoc. Oh, hey, sorry, we've been so busy trying to get this filled. We did end up having to go externally or whatever that looks like. Here's some ad hoc feedback. That is where you lose morale right there, is when that's when you start to get those feelings of, was I really even considered in the first place? But I think the feedback has to be timely, and it has to follow the same pattern that you probably would if you were working with external candidates. You're going to update external candidates if the job requisition has been filled. Yeah, hopefully. That's another thing I suggest, right? I guess that doesn't always happen either, but that's another thing that I highly recommend, is that you are updating external candidates. And that feedback to internal candidates is really a piece that's essential, because hopefully they're still going to remain employed within the organization. Now, this is a little bit of a tangent thought, but with that, when you know that you are hiring somebody externally for a role where there was a lot of internal interest for that, I think one of the biggest things to do is find somebody who knows how to handle that situation. Say you're hiring for a manager or a director who is now going to have people directly reporting to this person who wanted that job, that person has to be able to handle that situation as part of that leadership structure or whatever the role is. They have to be able to understand how to navigate working with a team, understanding that there were a lot of people who wanted that job.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a tangent thought, but when you're looking at that external candidate, to make sure that they would be prepared and have the experience or be upskillable to know how to do that. But with your internal candidates, I think the feedback should happen before they randomly see somebody starting in that role.
Yeah.
And not as an afterthought.
Yeah. Those are great insights, Tyler. Kelly, what would you add? What are your thoughts on internal recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tyler is right on the point, especially with management and director, because that is so common more often than not that they will bring in somebody external after interviewing internal candidates. Like, it is more common than most people realize. And if you don't know how to handle that or manage those people because they're going to have resentment towards this individual, then you're already creating a problem for turnover. One thing that I always say when it comes to building out an internal structure, especially if you're brand new to HR or just even trying to experiment with your managers, is have a very set process, because that only helps you to set up success when it comes to time for rejection. No internal applicant should ever be applying to a job without talking to their current manager first. That should be the best practice. Does it happen? No, especially in larger companies, but it is best practice. So if I got an internal applicant, I would talk to that person and say, does your manager know? If they say yes, then it's like, okay, let's have that conversation with your manager to see if this makes sense to put you in this process, or if it's something that we need to wait on until the next opportunity comes aboard. Or are you fast tracked because you've been identified as a potential hire for this role because it's a promotion? It's really dependent, but having that conversation only helps when it comes to time for rejection, because then you're setting up expectations along the way. And the sooner you can start to set up those expectations, the easier it is to let somebody down, especially if you kind of set that up front. So I did have an individual interview for a leadership position. Wasn't even qualified because they were still within their probation period. Very clearly states that you cannot apply for a promotion when you're in your probationary period. However, the manager valued this individual. He was a top performer and a great asset altogether. He was a phenomenal person. And so we're like, this person, we said, hey, you cannot qualify for this promotion, but we want you to interview because we want you to go through these steps, because we want to know more about you, what you can bring to the table. And that way we know for future references, when this opens, you can be fast tracked. And so they set that up right up at the very front, that you're not going to get the job, but this is that step for that next opportunity. That's super rare, but the more you can have those conversations up front before you put somebody in the process, and letting a current manager know, not only does that create a lot better collaboration and success when it comes time for rejection, the biggest issue is if you do get that job, your manager didn't know you applied to that job, you're already going to have managers fighting, and you're creating a whole nother scenario that you're going to have to deal with. So it's like, you might as well just knock that out of the park. So setting up that success can help you with those rejections. And just like Tyler said, it needs to be very clear as to why that is not happening. And it needs to be objectifiable, meaning there has to be something very tangible and clear from the job description that says, we needed just a little bit more of this expertise that this person brought. And like, you were right there, but it's not right there right now. Let's actually get you enrolled in a course. So next time around, we think there. So there needs to be a next step action item for development, because you will risk losing that person if you reject them. So no, if you're going to reject them, have some sort of next step action item to help them develop in order to at least minimize the risk of them leaving. But that, what Tyler said, I think is absolutely clear, is the feedback. And unfortunately, I think both of us have seen a lot of people, even externally, don't get feedback. If you don't do that internally, that's 10 times as worse. So just that feedback piece has to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the why, I think, is really important with internal candidates. And I don't know if you're posting a job externally, if it always makes sense to call up every single applicant to just tell them we're not going to consider you. That is not always feasible or possible. But I think it does make sense. And this is one area where I think it does make sense to have or allow for a difference in your process with internal versus external candidates. I do think every single internal candidate should get feedback, the specific feedback of why they are not being, if they're not going to be considered at all, why they're not being considered. in addition to the ones that maybe went through process and then weren't actually selected.
Yeah. Having that next step though too, that's why you have to have that relationship with the manager, because they're the ones that are going to kind of be your champions in that process. Because like Tyler said, you may not be able to give everybody feedback, especially if you have a lot of internal folks, like in the CEO's case. But at the same time, if you have their managers to rely on and really facilitate those conversations, and you're helping them and coaching them through that, then they can kind of be your branches of information. And again, it has to be objectifiable, because if it's not, and they're like, well, they just didn't like me, you're going to see turnover. Like, it's just going to happen. So it has to be job specific.
Yeah.
So and since we're in the HR panel, that's also when you're going to start seeing yourself looking at unemployment claims.
Yep. It can certainly come up that way.
That'll be probably another
topic for another day.
Another topic, yeah.
I want to segue into actually a question from the audience. So Tamara, and this goes right along with the conversation we're just having around hurt feelings. So she says, I 100% like the idea of internal recruiting, but the organization I'm now working for has an issue with internal poaching. So you and I think, Kelly, you were starting to hint on this, that, if the manager's not even aware, right, and the marketing is trying to steal, department is trying to steal somebody from sales, and suddenly there's a switch, that's kind of an awkward situation. So, Kelly, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this first, and then Tari.
I've actually done this myself. I've stolen people. We had a senior administrative assistant at one of my clients, and I was like, you are phenomenal. I need you like more, and I need you to be more HR. And so instead of stealing her, so to speak, I played the political way correctly, and I went to their manager, and it was more about developing them into an office manager to take on more HR related responsibilities. So I still kind of won, and then they also got to develop. But this is a really common issue with larger companies, because there's a lot harder channels to communicate, or there's more silos, or there's animosity that's going to create silos or difficulty communicating. Honestly, the best way to handle this is when that person is applied, because they should technically apply before anything happens in the process. So a recruiter is always going to know if there is somebody in that process, or they should. That's why you want that job board, a piece of it, so that there's always a point of contact. That recruiter needs to know to go out to that person and say, does your manager know? If the answer is no, it says, our internal process means that you have to have a current meeting with your manager to let them know that you are applying to another opportunity. One of my friends did this, and she was about to change roles. Instead, they promoted her because they wanted to keep her on their team. And so now she's promoted in her own organization, running a huge part of the department, because she was going to apply because she needed a change in her daily routine based on travel needs, right? And so that's why she applied. Once her manager was aware of that, and that she had applied and she was about to get an offer, he was like, oh, no. We have this need already. We'll promote you. That meets your needs. You can stay here. And they already had other candidates, because it was a huge corporation that had, multiple people to consider. So it worked out for everyone in that regard. That's a slight example, but that's an example where just having a conversation with a manager to make them aware, or let the recruiter know that, hey, we're going to have a conversation with your manager, sets up those expectations as to whether or not they're going to move forward. If they're ready to move forward, do they truly meet those qualifications? Does that manager need a little bit more time with them versus not? Or, making sure that they're aware of this opportunity. I will say there are rare moments where they're applying to a new position, or they're trying to get out of it because the manager is toxic. If that is the case, that is a very different approach. That may be where you need another coach involved or another HR manager. It's a little too complex to get into this particular topic, but it's something where you're going to need additional support before having that conversation with that candidate, as well as that manager, because that may include different types of processes and investigations regarding that. So stop internal poaching, have a very set process. Make sure that when they apply, a recruiter makes notice that that internal person has either let the manager know, or they are aware they're going to have a conversation with the manager to let them know they're applying. That should at least mitigate the potential of poaching. But again, that's not an all-end answer, but it's a great way to start that nailing down.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. I'm hearing a lot of process and communication And I mean, makes sense. That makes sense. Get your processes in order. And you suggested some really strong ones there. Tyler, what advice would you add for tomorrow? Internal
Yeah,
coaching.
I think it's all about transparency, and really this is a larger issue. This is a culture issue where the organization is feeling siloed to some degree. You're seeing a zero sum mentality instead of a variable sum mentality, but at the same time, it also makes sense. This is also a tough question to answer because it makes sense why the accounting team can't just afford to lose somebody to the revenue operations team, or why somebody in sales, like we have revenue targets to hit. We can't just put somebody over in marketing right now, right? Those conversations make sense. But and this is where I think my biggest suggestion is to start going upwards, because your top level is where you set the culture. And if you establish a culture that values growth and advancement and opportunity, then you will start to limit some of that silo mentality and some of that zero sum mentality. So some of this won't be able to just be solved by process when it is, if it's an overall culture issue where
Mhm.
teams do see this as we're losing somebody and not we're giving somebody an additional opportunity within our organization.
Yeah.
I don't care. Like, transparency is not going to fix that process, but I do think transparency is the biggest key to making all of these things or facilitating this smoothly. And you've got to be able to work with leadership. But yeah, it makes sense because the issue we talked about before. Backfill sucks. You know, you lose your best salesperson because they want to be a marketing professional, or you lose somebody on the marketing team because they really want to be just start developing code. You got to go find their replacement, and if they're just going to another team, that can be a very difficult situation to be in. And it's common. It's very common. But I think that approaching it from a cultural standpoint of this is an opportunity, not a net loss for the organization, is
Yeah.
a good way to approach that. And we also mentioned before, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot because you haven't lost. You may lose them today to another role within your organization, or they're just going to go to apply to another company to do what they want to do anyways.
Yeah.
And a
You're not
big
going to keep
piece of
them either
that,
way, most likely.
I'm
yeah, I
just
mean, the big piece of that too, real quick, is that transition policy, right? Like if they're still in the organization and they transition to a new role, then they're still there. Their
They
intellectual
can help.
property is still
Yeah.
there. They can help, they can onboard, they can mentor, they
yeah.
can facilitate a lot of that. But Tyler is absolutely 100% correct. If the leadership does not believe in growth or doesn't value that transparency, you're not going to win no matter what process. The process helps to facilitate less stress and more communication, but leadership sets the tone. And if they're setting a tone or a precedence that's the opposite of what you need, then there's another conversation that needs to be had altogether. But that is absolutely one of those things that if you're going to create an internal process, like Tammy said, that like, hey, we may have to have, a process in place. Start at leadership. What is our philosophy on internal growth? What is our philosophy for transitioning? What do we look like for this? Create that philosophy and that language and that value. Start at that top like discussion, and then that can transition into your process. So that way, at least there's alignment from the top down when it comes to that. But Tyler's absolutely right. If there is not that alignment up top, it doesn't matter what you put into place. It's going to be a really hard transition altogether.
Yeah.
One last thing I would add to that is just kind of piggybacking on what Kelly just put there. Call it what it is. And I think those conversations should be very clear. Hey, we want to make sure that we're not poaching within the organization, that we are recruiting people and we're promoting people in a way that is sustainable to the overall goals of the organization as well. And call it what it is. So nobody feels like that's not the right way to think, because again, it does make sense to in so many instances why it is difficult to feel like you just got poached, because there are real consequences to that.
Yeah. Beautiful. I think you guys really nailed that whole topic. I want to just cover one last thing pretty lightly, and then give both of you the opportunity to just kind of give your final bits of wisdom and advice to those listening and watching. And the last one is on at the end of internal recruitment. You have an employee in a new role, different pay, right? There's some things there. How does that is there like a re-onboarding process? And how is that different than if you're just bringing in someone fresh? And by the way, I mean, a lot of the times in onboarding, we talk about documents and things like probably already kind of have all that, right? But I'd love to hear your takes on how is onboarding different for an internal hire. And Kelly, we'll give you the first word on that one.
I tend to like having new offer letters and new transition documentation. The only reason why is because in the state of California, anytime there is a change to your job, it is required to have a signature on a document regarding that change so that it is fully verified by both the employee and the employer that that change has occurred. So I usually say if you can comply with California, you're good no matter where you are. So I prefer something simple like that. If you're going to be a manager, I usually like a kind of a manager code of ethics signature that just says like, you know, that things are different when you're a manager and there's different expectations. So an internal offer letter that just kind of states the new things, that's common practice for most folks, not always, but if it is not currently a practice, make it a practice that documents the changes. Then having an internal transition plan is huge. This is where it differs from an external onboarding, right? The cultural pieces are a little bit different. Are there leadership principles that they didn't have before that they was part of the onboarding? Maybe you go through that. Those types of things may differ from depending on the level of responsibility. But I think overall, it's more about the transition. How does that look? What does that look like for both teams to ensure success on both sides? Do you help with the backfilling? Do you not? Do you help with their onboarding? Do you not? Do you kind of share responsibility between the two roles until that backfilling is there? And then do you transition? So the onboarding is more about the transition phase and figuring that out, and then possibly more job shadowing to facilitate maybe some upskilling there if there is something that may need to be an additional skill set. So I think it just depends more on the individual, but the overarching process should be more about the successful transition for success on all sides than anything else.
Yeah, it's a good word, transition. Yeah, Tyler, what would you add?
And I know everyone hates this answer, but I think it depends on what the role is, how far of a leap it is for the person going into this. If it's a promotion where they've already been conducting 75% of their responsibilities, you may not have in the same exact department, you may not have a very long onboarding or transition process, but this is going to a completely different team in a different part of the organization that they hadn't previously been in before. I think it does make sense to have a little bit more of a structured onboarding, training, and transition process. Obviously, you'll hopefully be able to move past some of the things, payroll, that you hopefully already have their payroll, right? And some of those initial onboarding pieces. But do you have them sit in with a group of new hires and go through like the new hire official training? Maybe there are some cases where that could make sense, but I think it does make sense to at least have something. Because I think typically you see organizations moving so quickly that someone gets promoted and it's really just, we've just got to keep running. We've just got to keep rushing. And that's when I think you start to develop an organization where people are undertrained and underskilled. Yeah. So I think it depends on how structured it will be, but I think that you should at least plan on some type of onboarding transition process, even if it does look different, depending on how big the promotion is or how big the reorganization is or what that looks like.
Yeah, still do something. Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you two so much. I want to give you this is the mic drop moment we give to all of our panel guests. So in one or two sentences, what is your best piece of advice for the people who are watching, listening right now and thinking, man, I'm ready to step up my game in internal recruitment, or I want to start doing this because our organization doesn't do it at all. What's your advice for getting started in this? Tyler, I'll let you share first, and we'll give Kelly the last word.
Yeah, as a talent acquisition professional, you're always up against budgets, costs. So I advocate always looking internally, even if you think that you may not have the right fit for a role. Don't assume. Don't assume you don't have somebody who could be the right fit for the role, because if you're going to be looking externally at transferable skill sets, you might as well look internally for transferable skill sets as well. Yeah. And one of the greatest things about, again, looking at this like a function of cost, it doesn't cost you any additional budget to just ask your hiring managers who they may have, who's ready to take on additional responsibility or who's interested in developing skill sets in other areas. So it's a fantastic way to fill jobs in your organization. that increases the morale of the people in your organization, that doesn't cost you a ton of money, that just dumping money and money and money into promoting posts on Indeed and LinkedIn and places like that.
Yeah, I love that. No assumptions and save some money.
Yes.
Who doesn't love money and saving it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say I would approach it from just a little bit of an outside talent acquisition, because Tyler said it perfectly, right? When you're very focused on the talent acquisition part, there are budgets out the wazoo that you got to think about, and you're dealing with people's talents. And there's a lot of people who have more talents in the table than we know. I approach it more from what I do. I work with people and helping to reinvent what it looks like to be in the workplace, because the workplace is a little, blasé at the moment. Honestly, people want growth. Some people don't, and they make that clear, and that is phenomenal. We need them too. But people who want growth are also pretty vocal, and some of them are not. And it is our job as human resources professionals or people professionals or talent acquisition professionals to always be problem solving those gaps in talent and in people. And so having conversations around growth, having conversations around the ability to promote, transfer, try something new, transferable skill sets, whatever that may be, that's our job to do. And so having an internal recruiting process altogether is a must-have, not only for your growth of your organization, but also for the retention pieces of your organization. If you don't have that in place, you are going to probably lose out on your retention. And then you're going to have another problem for talent acquisition, because you're having turnover and having to backfill and everything else. So you might as well have this additional resource to facilitate the growth, the expedited growth of your organization, your people, the conversations you have, and you'll be excited to see what people can really light up about in their roles. People have I've hired a journalist for instructional design. Like, that is absolutely outside of their whole realm, but their storytelling skill sets perfectly transitions into instructional design. It doesn't have to be so fundamentally traditional, but to have that resource and that mindset of somebody's interested in something and you can keep them on board and grow them, and therefore grow your environment and your culture and your organization, that is what we do. And that's why having this is so important, and having that conversation start at the top so that you can start building your process for alignment is key, especially when you're smaller, because they're going to have a larger say. So I would say the first thing that you should do if you want to do this and move forward is start the conversation and see where it goes, and listen to all of the benefits and know the cons and know how to navigate the cons, and then get started on the actual process.
Yeah. But just get started on it. Love it. Well said. Well, thank you two so much. For those watching at home, we always share this kind of slide at the end. If you want to learn more about internal recruitment, Tyler has actually written an entire article about it in our encyclopedia. So check that out. There's the link. And go meet these two panelists. They're fantastic. You obviously know at this point how knowledgeable and wise they are. There are just so many great insights in this whole conversation. So connect with them on LinkedIn and get to know them better. Tyler and Kelly, thank you so much. We hope we can have you back again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen.
See you guys.
Bye.